I love drinking the tears of lock manufacturers who do not know how to respond correctly to someone finding a bypass to their lock. Finding vulnerabilities in locks. It's one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do I find vulnerabilities in locking systems? And the answer is actually very simple. This video might disappoint quite a few of you, but I'm going to go through my multi-step process on how I start looking at locks and then how we develop tools and weaponize the exploit and then see what our signature is when we actually do the exploit against the lock. Now, this video is going to focus primarily on mechanical locking systems. I can do a different video on electronic access control, RFID, or alarm systems as well, how we find vulnerabilities in those, but it's going to be quite different than how I find vulnerabilities in mechanical locking systems. And that's just because one requires a lot more different tool sets than the mechanical locking systems itself. But I think that's just why this is a very good intro to how do you start finding vulnerabilities, because it's very available to everyone who just wants to start diving in and finding, a way to bypass a lock or open a lock in a way that it wasn't meant to originally be opened. So let's talk about the first step that I do. My first step when it comes to finding vulnerabilities is I look up the patent information that I can find on that lock. A lot of locks will be patented. Their design, even the keys, will be patented. So I will look up everything I can from that perspective. With that, when you're looking up the patent itself, you don't just want to look at the actual patent that you're trying to pull up. You want to look at the related material or other related patents and start reading through all those. And it will give you a better idea of the journey that the engineer or the designer went through when it came to actually patenting or designing that particular lock or that key or that mechanism or whatever you're looking at. Now, if you're looking up patents, you can use like Google Patent and stuff like that. The one thing I would recommend is you never pay for a patent search. That is just a waste of time and a waste of money. You will get the patents, but you can find those same type of patents and the related materials, which a lot of times these services, what they'll say is, oh, you'll find the other materials or the other related patents that, borrowed a design or are being used by this particular item. You will find that already in like the Google patent search. So don't pay for this service. Just use Google or there's other free services out there that you can do a patent search on as well. It's supposed to be publicly available information, so you don't need to necessarily pay for that information. So once I've looked at the patent itself and I've looked at the related patents and all those other items, what I will do is I'll look to see if there's any material around this lock that the manufacturer has put out, or maybe other people have put out already. So manufacturing videos are very nice because they'll have like 3D models of the lock exploded out with all the pieces, and I can really see, how everything interacts with each other with these videos. So they're very helpful for us. And when we start walking down this path, we sometimes will revert back to those videos when we actually have the lock in front of us. But I want to note that I haven't purchased the lock yet, right? There's still one more step that I have to go through before I purchase the lock itself. We don't want to be spending all this money to then find out, oh, yeah, this is not going to work, or we've just spent $300 and they've buttoned up quite a few things, or the attack that I was planning on doing is just not going to work on that. We want to do as much research as possible before we actually start spending real dollars. So my next thing that I'll look up is any service manuals, installation manuals, anything around there that locksmiths will use. And this will give us more insight, maybe insight to the different types of locks that they have or the different types of situations which a particular lock might be used in, any other variants that they could have on it and stuff like that. This will be very helpful to understand how this lock is supposed to be installed or how the mechanism is supposed to be installed and used. And we can utilize that because then we'll know how it is actually installed or utilized in the field. And again, we're just doing everything here in the lab so far. So there's actually a little sub-step in between this and before we purchase the lock. What I will do is I will make sure, let's say I'm purchasing a complete lock, or maybe it's a padlock or something like that. If it comes with a core installed into that padlock, I will see if that core is made either by that manufacturer or made by a third-party manufacturer, and I will look up that particular core. And a lot of times what you'll see lock manufacturers will be producing housings, and then they'll put someone else's core in there. And I want to know everything that I can know about that particular core. So I might have a lock that, is made in Germany, or a housing or a padlock housing that's made in Germany, or companies claim that, our lock is made in America, but it's really the housing, and then they use some like cheap Chinese lock inside of it. And, it feels a little disingenuous marketing it as made in Germany or made in America or something like that. And they're putting like cheap Chinese locks into their product. And it's really just the housing that they're making themselves. I would like it to be like housing made in America, lock made in China or something like that. But manufacturers aren't going to go and do that, right? That would probably hurt their sales. Once I figure out, okay, they produce the lock and they produce the housing or whatever, they produce the mechanism and then you slap in your own lock afterwards. Once I have all that information, I can then go purchase the lock. And I like to purchase 3 copies of the lock. So the first copy of the lock, I'm going to be taking it apart. I'm going to be using the key, opening it up, see how it functions, see how it feels, and then I'm going to start disassembling the lock itself. And this is a normal part of the process. This is what every person who finds exploits in locks or bypasses does. They take the lock, they open it up, they see how it works, they take it apart, just like a locksmith would, right? But we are trying to find a bypass for the lock. We're not trying to figure out how we can best utilize this lock. So we take it apart, we disassemble it, and we'll even disassemble like the core inside the lock. So if we have the housing in the core, and then we have the padlock housing itself or shell, we'll take apart the core, we'll see how it's pinned up, we'll see if they're using any tomfoolery in there, and then we'll measure things out. We'll measure the spring sizes, pin sizes, all these different variants, so we can try to build this attack chain in our head. And once we've done that, once we start building this attack chain, we start noticing how the lock functions inside, like padlock housing, how it functions inside something else, right? So let's say I have an Adams Right mechanism, and then I have a Medico lock on the front of that. Okay, well that's a pretty good combo. Now the Medico lock, though, what we'll have a lot of times is the plug will be broached all the way through, and then the tail on the end that is screwed into the plug that actually interfaces with the Adams Right mechanism itself will be an open tail system. So when we look at this, we notice, hey, this Adams Right system, we can actually, this dead latch can actually be disengaged by moving this little lever on the inside. But how do I get there? Well, we start stacking vulnerabilities. Hey, this plug is broached all the way through. The tail piece for this particular lock is also open. So now I can stick a wire in there and then turn this mechanism. And really what we're doing is we're taking a whole bunch of little smaller, low-risk security items and we're combining them together into an attack chain to then have a high-risk vulnerability or a bypass for the lock itself. The next step after that is I will design the tool that I need to have to bypass, or I will repurpose another tool if I notice that a bypass will work. So if I'm repurposing another tool, right, I can have push wires that can also activate the Adams Right latch or dead latch release mechanism. There is, various Adams Right bypass tools, of course. But let's say I didn't have that. I just had some thin wire. I can actually bend it and then make a bypass tool itself. Or if I need to make a custom design, I will also do that in this stage. And what we're doing is we're taking that bypass that we found, or we're taking all those weaknesses that we found then to then develop a bypass with a tool. And we are weaponizing the bypass at this time. That's what it's called in the industry, is you're weaponizing your exploit. Just like if I were to reverse engineer a piece of software, find a vulnerability in there, I would then write code to then exploit that vulnerability. I'm doing the exact same thing, but we're doing it in a much more physical nature, right? So I'm using Dremels, I'm using thin wire, I'm using mills, I'm using presses, hammers, stuff like that. I find a lot of times that a good pair of pliers, some disassembly tools like screwdrivers, and then a Dremel really allow me to find tons of exploits and locks, as well as being able to, actually go and build a tool to bypass it. Now, one other tool that I didn't mention in here, and I want to mention it now, is when we need to see inside the lock. Instead of using one of our fancy scopes, the first thing that we'll use is actually a very cheap lot scope, right? So there's various different types. This is one that I have. It's actually a wafer decoder, but it's just a lock scope that I use when I'm trying to find that bypass. So we'll use it in between the getting the lock and taking it apart stage. But then we'll also use it when we are inspecting the lock post-exploitation. We'll talk about that in a second. But I'll go and I will make the tool, make the exploit, and I will weaponize it. I will practice it many, many times so I can become proficient in it. Then I can either train a team that needs to use it. So let's say a group of law enforcement, or let's say we have a government group, or even just private red teamers that need to get through this lock. I will then develop this, teach this, and then they can then interact with that lock in a way that I taught them so that they can bypass the mechanism and get into where they need to get into. But there's one last step that we do in here. So we've done our research, we've bought the lock, we've taken it apart, we've tried it on a fresh lock as well, so that's 2 locks. Then I have a third lock. And my third lock is the lock where we start looking at our signature of the bypass. And our goal here is signature reduction. I want to minimize the amount of scrape marks and stuff like that I leave on the lock. Or if I can't, I want to know what type of scrape marks are being left on the lock, so I can then compile that in my forensic information later on. But also I can be aware when I'm using this exploit in the field, what I'm leaving behind in terms of evidence. Because signature reduction is the name of the game. We want to take our covert attack and make it go all from covert to surreptitious to clandestine, right? If we can take our basic surreptitious attack and now make it a clandestine attack because it's not leaving any identifying marks that can really lead to a way of compromise, that is going to be beneficial to us. So we're trying to do signature reduction in this step, and then marking or taking notes of where marks are actually being left. And you might have to do this with a few different locks, but you can generally just do this in one lock if you're doing it from the very beginning. You baseline the lock, so you take it apart with the key, you see how everything is working, and you take photos of everything, and then you put it together and you start bypassing it. Then you take photos, investigation photos, we'll call them, from there to then build what marks are you leaving behind. And then we want to modify our tool or change our method of entry or change what we're doing so that we can leave less marks inside the lock. And then we can go to commercialization, right? We can sell our tool, we can go do all these things. Now, from the manufacturing side, right, some manufacturers are taking the proactive step and they're hiring people like myself or others to find bypasses in their locks so that they can shore those up before they actually sell them to their clients. If a manufacturer is not doing that, I think the manufacturer of that locking mechanism or the housing or anything like that is not serving their clients to the best possible level that they should be, especially when something like physical security, right? Your little cheesy videos showing that, oh yeah, this can't be open with a bolt cutter or something like that is not good enough when we're talking about people protecting their equipment, their hard-earned property, or even sometimes protecting their own life. When I see manufacturers that, are very angry at individuals who are trying to find these exploits, I just note in myself hey, that's just not a manufacturer that I'm going to recommend, right? Let's take a large example. In the RFID world, HID was very sue happy with a lot of people. So HID, instead of going and working with the community, they would just try to sue the community. And HID got a terrible rap for that. And then what people started to do is they would develop exploits for HID. Would they tell HID so HID could repair them? No. They would just sell them to some other group, right? Whether that be a US clandestine group or whatever, right? So HID would never know this. Their product's vulnerable. There's exploits against it, and then their customers are vulnerable. And that's because HID took this approach, which was, hey, we're just going to sue everyone. HID has changed their ways. They're working with private researchers. They're working with consultancies. They're looking into bug bounty programs and all these stuff. So they have changed their ways. They've seen, hey, this is not how we actually produce good product for our customers anymore. They have realized, they have seen the light, let's say, and they're now working with all these different groups, paying people, as well as taking in feedback from the community and not just suing people when they find a vulnerability in their locking system. And a company that's been doing this pretty good right off the bat. In the physical security world, though, let's just talk about analog locks, is like Paclock, right? Paclock is not a sponsor of this video. Paclock doesn't even know who I am, right? I've purchased some of their locks before, but I'm not friends with them, but I do know that they have been very responsive to the community. And we're talking about even the hobbyist community, not even the professional community, right? They've gone down and been responsive to the hobbyist community, to social media people and stuff like that. And they find vulnerabilities, or someone finds, something that's a little bit off or that can weaken the lock. And Paclock will change something, or they'll address it, or they'll add better pins into the lock to make it a little bit harder to get through, or they'll add additional metal, or they'll change something so that it actually will produce a better product. Which is why Paclock is one of the locks that I recommend to a lot of my clients when they need like a padlock type solution. I'm recommending Paclock to them because they are such a great company that has taken an active step in wanting to better their product. And that's what we want to see from manufacturers, right? We don't want to see manufacturers get butthurt. You can get butthurt, right? Someone's telling your baby's ugly. I know, I tell people their baby is ugly all the time, but it all depends on how you respond. And if you respond incorrectly, well, you're just going to garner more hate from the community, and more people are going to start bagging on your locking system. But if you do it correctly, you'll get high praise, and a lot of people will want to start working or recommending your products. And that's the other side of finding exploits, right? It's all good and fun to find exploits. I found a ton of exploits. I've been paid to find exploits before in locking systems and access controls and alarm systems. And I've taught on how to develop these bypasses. I've taught on the actual bypasses that I've developed or others have developed. And it all comes down to, how are you going to respond from this as a manufacturer? And if you respond incorrectly, it can hurt your business, right? But if you respond correctly, it can actually help and boost your business. So this video is for people that were interested in it. I know some manufacturers I've always been interested in the process that I've gone through when it comes to exploiting their locks. Like I said, on the physical locking side, there's not much to it. It just requires a lot of research, a lot of understanding how manufacturers work, how machining works, and how the physical side works, right? And even if you're not physically inclined, you can really just look at it and dissect it piece by piece to build that puzzle in your head, to then develop that exploit and go and find what needs to be done. With all that, what are your thoughts, right? How do you find exploits in locks? What do you do when you find an exploit in a lock? Have you approached a manufacturer ever before? Has a manufacturer approached you? I want to hear all these things in the comment. I appreciate you watching. As always, stay safe, keep it legal, and happy hacking. Take care.